I wondered, in thinking about kind of the trajectory of your life and ending up in the San Luis Valley and in the 70s working with Chicano professors on an issue that most Anglos weren't looking at,
Hmm.
in a region where most Anglos weren't going.
Yeah,
Um, is there something about growing up in rural Iowa that pushed you when you got into college to study these types of things or have interest in?
I think so. I think because the land, I mean, I have that's a real value to me. I mean, I grew up on a farm, so having, when it was a small farm, of course, a family farm is way different than the farms of today. But I have a strong connection to the land. And I live here in Center, Colorado, the northern part of the valley, and I've lived here for over 40 years. I got interested in this area when I came as a volunteer, actually, with the Catholic Church. I came for a year in the late 60s. And then after a year, I went up to CU Boulder to finish my degree. And then I always stayed interested in the valley and kept coming back. And I decided to do a independent study of the Conejos Land Grant. I don't really remember how I got interested in that, but I did, and spent about a couple years during my undergraduate work researching the Conejos Land Grant, and I found a lot of the original documents and studied those papers, and my premise was that uh, the people were given this grant and then it was taken from them really in an unjust system. And I was interested in following that up, following through with that to the present time, because I think that pattern has continued in one form or another. Actually, I was quite influenced by a priest who ran the volunteer program, or was part of the volunteer program that um, I joined. I joined up just for the experience, and then I suddenly had my eyes opened and saw. I grew up the community I grew up in was all white and pretty level economically. I mean, we didn't really have rich and poor. It was pretty level. And all of a sudden, I saw, you know, poverty and how people didn't, you know, the discrepancy between what some had and some didn't have, and the disparity of opportunity. How a child who goes to school having had a upper middle class beginning with lots of books and family vacations, and opportunities to do a lot of things, and well cared for. I mean, had all their needs met and so forth. How that was such an advantage over a child who grows up in poverty, doesn't have books in the house, maybe they don't even have paper and pencil. Their parents work long hours. They may or may not always have nutritious meals, and just
Maybe you can tell us a little bit more about what you found specifically in looking into the Conejos Land Grant, and what some of the highlights were in terms of your findings after you dug through the documents and such.
okay. Well, I have my paper here, which I'll give you. Uh, the grant was made by Mexico. It was a Mexican grant, not a Spanish grant. But it was customary in those times to give parcels of land to people in outlying areas, because to protect the land, to keep the land in the possession of first Spain and then Mexico. So the Conejos grant was given, and I can show you. You probably have these maps too. But it was one of the Mexican grants, and it was. You've probably seen this map. These were the land grants of the valley. You've seen these, and it was one of these grants. This one right here. It encompassed quite a bit of the valley, actually, along with the Sangre Cristo grant in the eastern part of the valley and the Baja grant up here, also in Zolage County. And the boundaries of the grant were kind of vague boundaries, from the San Antonio Peak, which we all know, to the La Garita Mountains, and from the Rio Grande to the San Juan Mountains. So that was a parcel of land that was given in 1833 by the Mexican government, and it was given to 4 petitioners. The petitioners were Jose Maria Martinez, Antonio Martinez, Julian Gallegos, and Celedon Valdez. So you're familiar with those names. On behalf of themselves and 80 other heads of families. And so the grant was given, and by a man named Saraceno from the I believe he was governor of New Mexico. And then the people were led onto the land by Cornelio Vigil, and they were put in possession of the land. And it was of interest to me the pattern that they did this, because everybody needed water, and water's crucial, of course, to farming, which they were interested in. Everybody was given a strip of land that bordered the river and then extended. They were given 200 varas, which is about 200 yards, I think, roughly. And that extended miles back, so that everybody had a piece of the river, a piece of farm land, some timber land. So the land was like communal. It was people got to have their parcels, but they were also required by the conditions of the grant to share the communal lands and the timber gathering lands. So the people were provided for. I believed that was my premise, so that everybody's needs would be met. So this distribution was done, and people began to come up to the grant. But then there was a period of time when the Navajo people were at war. They didn't, this was frontier, and so the people went back to their place of origin, which was the area of Abiquiu and El Rito and those towns in northern New Mexico. So the people went back and until those wars with the Navajos subsided, and then they reapplied for permission to own this land and to travel to it. And so they reapplied in, I believe it was 1842, and then again they were given granted the land, and they came again to the land, and it was distributed. And the document said they threw rocks and pulled up grass and shouted for joy, and they were happy to receive this land. So they began to come to the land, and from those northern New Mexico villages, and they came in their ox carts and burros and horses or on foot with what they had, and began to build their homes. And they started with what they called jacales, which were structures that were made out of logs and mud and just kind of tied together like little forts almost. And they came to the community that they called Guadalupe, and began to settle there. And there were several families that came, and it was kind of, they planted. I have accounts in my paper of families who came and planted wheat or planted corn, and then harvested it, and then they kind of went back and forth to northern New Mexico while they were trying to settle the land, and again had problems with Indians. And so then in the meantime, the land changed hands because of the war with Mexico. And instead of being Mexican territory, it became the territory of the United States. And the Treaty of Guadalupe in 1848 was signed, which supposedly protected the settlers who received these grants. So the people just didn't. I think it was so far in the frontier, so far outlying, that they just continued their life. And they didn't. Nothing changed much for them, whether they were Mexican citizens or United States citizens. They just continued to build and to plant and so forth. And there were several communities that sprung up, and I have a little map of that, which you're probably familiar with too. I have a list of the settlers, and from both the 1833 distribution of land and the 1842. But here is a map of the early settlements that sprung up along the river, the Conejos River, and also the San Antonio River. And there's quite a few, and there were hundreds of people, according to some records of taxpayers, like tax rolls. When the United States took over this land, they set up the Office of Surveyor General, which was in 1854, and the Office of Surveyor General was charged with examining the grant documents, information, and verifying the validity of the various grants. So these people applied, I guess, through the Surveyor General's office. But at that time, there was a lot of other things going on too. The Surveyor General's office was overwhelmed, and they didn't really see to everything. And in the meantime, there was a lot of land speculation. There was a lot of people trying to get possession of the land. There was a lot of shady dealings. There was a group called the Santa Fe Ring of people who were trying to swindle these grantees, settlers of their lands, or trying different ways of getting the lands from them. One of the most famous was a man named Catron, I believe, or C-A-T, Catron, and he was one of the biggest crooks that was alleged, and it was said that the land grant land were the foundation of his wealth, his holdings. And he happened to be the attorney for the land grant petitioners when they ultimately went to the court of private land claims. I felt that it was more the Anglo people swindling the land from the Mexican settlers. It was a clash of cultures, because the other thing that happened at that time was that the Homestead Act was passed. Gold was discovered in the Rocky Mountains, and a lot of settlers were moving west, and Anglo settlers were moving west. And the Homestead Act just provided this land to people to come and for people to claim. And so it happened that a lot of the people who came in then from the east were Anglos. And there were also some of the descendants of the grantees or Hispanic people who also applied for the homestead claims, maybe because they thought that was the only way they could get the land, or maybe because they understood that was required of them, or maybe they thought that was insurance, even though they knew they were grantees, but they also better apply for this to make sure that they had. It's hard to know, I guess, but there were some families that were granted homesteads, and that was actually used as an argument in the court of private land claims. It was an argument that that the grant was not valid because the people went ahead and applied for homestead claims because they didn't really believe in the grant. So all this was going on. Land was changing hands, and it was one of the interesting. I think it was an interesting cultural difference between the long farm,
The Vegas.
the Vegas and the strips of farming land was in contradiction to the 160-acre plots of the Homestead Act, which was a good system for the Midwest because they had plenty of rain and they didn't have, it was on flat land. It was a different kind of land system in the Midwest, but here in the valley and in the West, where it was arid, there was need for people to have a piece of the river, and there was the mountain land where wood was gathered and so forth, and so there was a clash of two different systems there that worked against the Hispanic settlers. So after 40 years or something, that nothing was done by the Surveyor General. And in the meantime, a lot of other people moved in, and there was a lot of changing hands. The grant document was gone, and finally, though, because there was unsettled matters with the land grant claims, the Court of Private Land Claims was formed in 1891, and that's when Crescencio Valdez applied to the Court of Private Land Claims for validation of the grant, and it was denied. And it was denied. One of the main reasons was because they didn't have the grant document, and also they didn't do a survey. There were some real reasons why it was difficult for the grantees to be able to prove their points. One being the cost of the survey. A land survey would have helped, but that was very expensive. Another was because if they could go to Washington to lobby or make certain contacts or visit the congressman involved, that would help. But that's of course very costly and almost impossible. And also many people didn't understand English and didn't understand the process. They didn't understand what was going on. Oh, and because a lot of that land had already been settled, and it was awkward, it was difficult for the court to say that it made it hard for the court to rule for the settlers. And then there had been a lot of abuse and crooked practices in the land offices and so forth.
In doing your research, did you stick mostly to like the libraries and written records, or did you speak to anybody about the grant?
I did. I talked to people in the down in that area. Let's see, I have a list here of people that I spoke to. Mr. Abe Espinosa of Conejos, Albert Lobato of Antonito, Eliuto Medina of San Luis, Antonio Lucero of Antonito. Spoke to, this is Professor Jose Leonis. He was a professor in Boulder, and Salvador Ramirez was also a professor in Boulder.
In talking to these folks, what was your general impression about the long-term effects of losing the land grant on the community?
I think people felt that they were swindled. My research went on but I didn't include it all in my paper because I ran out of time and money and I had to graduate, so I had to get the paper done. I heard stories about the Warshowers. Probably have encountered the Warshower family in Antonito. They were big sheep ranchers, and they ended up getting a lot of the land from people in ways that were not really ethical. Maybe they were legal, but not ethical. And you've seen the Warshower Mansion in Antonito, and that was, of course, a very elaborate home at that time. And people felt that they they got their wealth by swindling, some of the local sheep ranchers and so forth, and eventually one of them hung himself, I believe, committed suicide anyway, and that kind of at the end of it, I don't know if they lost some of their wealth, or I can't remember that, but that's a story about that could be explored. I think that would be very interesting. And one of the stories that was told to me was that what he would do is the market for the sheep was in Pueblo, I believe, and he would buy sheep from the local sheep herders at a low price, and then take them, transport them to Pueblo, and sell the sheep there for a high price. So, it made it hard for the small sheep raisers to make money. I also did spend quite a bit of time in the assessor's office. I took a specific township and I looked at how the land was divided up in that township, and I drew, because I couldn't copy, I drew the plats. I copied the plats of this township, so that to see who lived on the land, and began to study how the land changed hands.
Was this in Oneida, or?
Yes, it's outside of Conejos, and it's along the San Antonio River. So you can see the pattern. This is the river lies here, more or less, in this along here, and you can see how the land was divided in strips. It passed from parent to children, and they divide up the land like this in small strips along the river, as opposed to, this is back farther, where the Homestead Act distributed land among people, and those were all done in the 160 squares. So there's a different, and that pattern persisted. I did this drawing every 5 years is how I did it, and it pretty much persisted. And I didn't have enough time to really completely. It took me a long time to put these maps together, and I didn't have a lot of time to study how the land actually did transfer. That shows that the land did leave the hands of the Mexicanos and get into other. So I think it would be interesting.
This is fascinating.
Yeah, and like that, then maybe they lost it to the bank, or
so
maybe
an
that
international trust company out Denver would have been like an investment company.
Yeah,
of some sort.
And I think there was a lot of that going on.
First National Bank. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
It would be really interesting in looking at this township in the when the availability of loans starts in the 1930s.
Oh yeah.
It'd be interesting to see who's getting those loans and try and tie some of those names to people on the map.
Yeah, right. That was kind of what I had in mind. I mean, that a study along those lines was what I had in mind, but ran out of time. What seemed to me the more human settlement style of people, settling close together, taking care of themselves, each other, and sharing, and that seemed like a more human community way of living, as opposed to, and less focus on profits. It was more at that point, of course, a lot of survival, and but then it became, then enter the profit system and the financial speculation, and how that clashed with the other values.
In talking to your I mean, you would come down and then you would go back up to Boulder. What did your professors, do you remember kind of their thoughts on what you're finding? And
I worked with, I was under the supervision of Salvador Ramirez. He was part of the Chicano Studies Project, and he was, he gave me information about the Mexican, what the Mexican government's view was. But I think most of this research was, new to him too. Most of what I was working on. So it was pretty independent, actually.
Were you surprised by what you found?
It kind of fit with what I believed, with what I'd come to believe just in my study, my interest in history. So, and it fits with, the whole capitalistic system that, that I think we have here in our country that favors the larger, in agriculture, the larger farms, the larger operations as opposed to the smaller. And I think it's hurt people. So what happened to people over time is they lost their land. Maybe they went to work for those people who got the land. That's like here in Center. Center is actually on the Conejos Land Grant. I don't think it was settled. It wasn't settled early like that. But people in the area there used to be small farmers, and people had little farms, and those are all gone. Everything is big now. And a lot of the speculation at that time, I suspect, was done by just outsiders, not even people who lived on the land or bought, worked the land, just people who were able to acquire the title and probably made profit selling it to others. And now I think what I've seen in this area, at least, is I think people actually do work the land. I mean, I think that the farms are large, very large, thousands of acres, but usually they're owned. I think that's changing too, though. I think I can see that in the 40 years I've lived here in Center, move from people having their farms and working their farms, even though they're large, Anglo farmers who hire Hispanic people to do the work, and there's been a lot of abuse in that system. But now I'm seeing some of those farms pass. It's like maybe the farmers have passed away, and their land is being sold then to larger and larger people, and I believe a lot of them are outside speculators. You have the example of J. Luis Rivera, who organized the sheep herders, sheep farmers, to sell their sheep together in cooperative. That seems to have the same tone as some of the local people here in Center who have struggled not for the land so much, but for a voice in the government, a role, seats on the town board, seats on the school board, a voice. There was quite a well-known redistricting lawsuit some years back that proposed that the congressional districts were slanted in a way that favored Anglos and disfavored Hispanics, and that succeeded, and the redistricting occurred that then brought in a fairer distribution of the population. It's the domination. It's domination. It's who has control, and I think that's been there's been years of Hispanic people organizing to get people registered to vote, to get the vote out, to get people in positions to have a voice in the local government.